Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett, and today I'm going to read to you from the third leg of the 5,000-mile journey the Seven Sisters take from London, England to Salt Lake City. It's called Seven Sisters, The Trek, Chapter 39. That's where we're starting today. Since the Saints had reached the Continental Divide and started down the other side, the mornings and evenings became very cold and crisp, and when the sun went down, jackets, coats, and shawls came out. Frost began to show up on the ground in the mornings, but as soon as the sun rose, it melted off quickly and promised a hot day ahead. It was hard to figure out why it got so hot and miserable during the day and so cold at night, but that condition was routine now, and they had to adapt to it. This morning, the Saints were doing their morning chores and bustling around to keep warm when they noticed a company of about 20 U.S. soldiers riding around the outside of the circled wagons. The soldiers didn't get very far before the word was spread to Captains MacArthur and Andrews, who asked other captains nearby to walk with them outside the wagons to see what the soldiers wanted. Trying to extend some cordiality, Captain MacArthur greeted their leader, who looked very young for his rank. His slight build and sparsely filled-in goatee and stringy handlebar mustache indicated he wasn't fully mature yet. "Morning, Lieutenant. You're off the beaten trail this morning. Can we offer you some dojons for breakfast, made with muddy water?" "We didn't come to eat. Who is the captain in charge of this train?" "That would be me. I'm Captain James MacArthur." The lieutenant's tone indicated he was all business. "I'm Lieutenant Gordon Walker from Fort Bridger, and we have official United States business. Every wagon train that passes this way to go west is required to take the Bridger Road to Fort Bridger and stop there to take the oath of allegiance to the United States of America." "Well, this is the first I've heard anything about it," bristled MacArthur. How far out of our way is it?" "Just 12 miles. "Just 12 miles? Why, that's a whole day's journey to go over there and another one to come back, just to get to this same place in our journey. I'm on a time constraint here. That would set me back 2 traveling days." "We have our orders," the lieutenant stated emphatically. MacArthur began to fume, and his voice rose. "When we made inquiry at Ham's Fork, the officer in charge told us we could take whichever road we wanted. He said there was no necessity for us to go on the Bridger Road unless we chose to, and we chose to come on this road, which follows the muddy river. We did this to save our cattle's feet, which are very tender. I'm sorry, Lieutenant, but I must vigorously decline your suggestion." "It's not a suggestion, Captain," the lieutenant snarled. "It's a demand." Captain MacArthur turned to the men around him in a plaintive way and studied their faces. They didn't respond verbally, but indicated with a nod of their heads that they would go along with whatever he said. Then an alternative plan came into his mind, and he went on. "I'll tell you what, Lieutenant. If you want, I can have all my men march over to Fort Bridger and take the oath required of them, but our oxen have hardly any water and food, hardly had any water and very little food for several days, and the roughness of Bridger Road, which has been reported to be the worst road this side of the Missouri River, could very well give our oxen out, and they could die. You have no right to put our cattle in jeopardy just because you want us to travel over to your fort so you can administer an oath. Now, if you have any right to search our wagons, you may do so, but we won't be going over to the fort." "Captain, if you don't bring your train to Fort Bridger, me and my 500 men will bring you there." He made a loud whistle to a lone soldier at the top of the nearby ridge, who in turn held his hand up high and gave a signal. 500 mounted soldiers immediately came into sight along the horizon. Captain MacArthur gulped, but pressed on. "I don't care if you have 500,000 men. Lieutenant, we have broken no laws and have the right to travel whatever road we know to be best for our cattle and our company." One of the soldiers behind the lieutenant shouted, "Why the hell are you parleying with him, Lieutenant? Why don't you just give the order? We've got our guns ready and we're awful good shots." The men behind him all shouldered their carbines, and cocked the hammers at the same time. It made loud, crackling, snapping sounds. The soldiers on the ridge did the same thing. The echo was chilling. Captain MacArthur suddenly felt dread travel from his head to his toes, and the hair on his body rose accordingly. Muffled screams and gasps were heard from the saints who were watching from inside the wagon ring. MacArthur didn't think the lieutenant would give the order to shoot, but he had a feeling he'd better comply with this request because of the wicked, murderous looks on the faces of the soldiers. He realized he had the power to murder all the saints right then and there, and it looked like they were just itching to do so. "All right, we'll go," he finally said with resignation. "I can see you are bound and determined that we travel over to your fort for the oath. So if you'll give us some time to get our passengers fed with what little they have to eat, and let us yoke our cattle and hitch up our wagons, we will comply with your orders. But I want it to go on record that we are protesting against this action mightily." The soldiers brought their guns down and carefully lowered the hammers, which immediately lessened the tension of the situation. "We'll retreat up the road a little way to wait for you," the lieutenant said, wanting to let MacArthur know he wasn't going to leave it up to them to lollygag their way over to the fort. The negotiating soldiers rode their horses back to join the 500, who had come down from the ridge on a gallop, and they all trotted a short distance away to wait for the wagon train so they could escort it to the fort. None of the saints were pleased with this turn of events, and none were more unhappy than Captain MacArthur. He couldn't help becoming a little oppositional when his entire train was required to go to Fort Bridger for no good reason. "If we have to go out of our way for this little side trip, the soldiers can wait and be inconvenienced for a short time while we get ready. Pass this word on to your companies of 10. Tell them to take their time, but cooperate fully with the soldiers so we don't cause any problems that might incite them to violence." After an hour, and when Captain MacArthur was good and ready, the train moved toward Fort Bridger on the rocky, uneven road before it. The wagons had only gone about 5 miles before the road started to ascend. The wagons and oxen eventually got to the point where they couldn't get up the rather steep hill without some extra help. "We'll need to double team each of the wagons to get them to the top," yelled Captain MacArthur to the captains, who in turn rode the length of the train to notify all the teamsters and able-bodied men that they needed to help with this difficult task. The soldiers rode their horses to the top and dismounted to sit on the ground and watch the show. "Looks like we're going to be entertained today, men. May I present the Mormon Comedy of Errors?" "Hey, was that written by Joseph Smith or William Shakespeare?" said one. "I forget." The soldiers guffawed loudly. It didn't occur to them or to their commanding officer that they might help. They were perfectly content to jeer, ridicule, and mock the pioneers in their struggles. The saints went to work and tried to ignore the boisterous soldiers. Some of the Utah boys, who were herding the loose cattle at the back of the train, yoked up pairs of oxen, brought them up to the front, and hitched them to the front of the oxen already there. The walking men moved in front of the oxen and tried to remove the large loose rocks on the trail, hoping to make the climb easier on the sore-footed oxen. Other men walked alongside and encouraged them forward. The pioneers assigned to each of the wagons helped push them from the rear to ease the strain on the oxen. It was a very slow and agonizing process to unhitch the double teams each time, rotate the teams so all of them did their fair share of pulling the 75 wagons up the hill. All the while, the fatigued oxen were making eerie, bellowing noises as if they were in deep distress. They seemed to be very uncomfortable, and some stumbled or tottered. When it was the sisters' turn to go up the hill, Caroline let Hurricane take over the reins. She had no idea how to control 4 oxen at the same time. "You'd better get down and walk, Sister Cleverly. We need to have the wagon as light as it can be to get up over the hill." Caroline didn't know quite what to make of that statement. Then her feathers got ruffled. "Are you suggesting I'm heavy, Mr. Hurricane?" Hurricane smiled. "No, Sister Cleverly, but 100 pounds is 100 pounds. Caroline could see she was getting offended over nothing of importance, and obediently got down. "Just one thing, Mr. Hurricane," she said. "Buck on the left. was staggering a little yesterday. I'll keep my eye on him. Caroline joined her sisters at the back of their wagon to help push. With 2 oxen in front of Buck and Doc, and the sisters pushing on the back, the load was considerably easier for the oxen, and they steadily moved the wagon up the hill. The soldiers had been having a heyday seeing who could say the rudest thing to the saints arriving at the top of the hill, and who could make their comrades laugh the most. The sisters were finally close enough to distinguish some of what they were saying. Have you ever seen so many walking lumps of dirt before? Hey, what color are you under all that dirt, missy? The sisters were mortified. They knew they looked bedraggled. It was a good thing their bonnets covered their flushing, weather-beaten faces. Walking 20 miles on the plains every day was a far cry from stepping out of their homes in England to go to church, visit their neighbors, or go to market. Caroline was about to cry when she looked down at her dirt-covered, sadly fitting, styleless donated dress. She had a moment of ingratitude as she thought of the beautiful wedding dress she left by the side of the tracks in the middle of Illinois State. Then she thought of all her dresses that were burned up in the fire on the train. Let's sing, Lavinia, she suggested. I don't want to hear any more from these coarse soldiers. With that suggestion, Lavinia began to sing in her loudest voice. Put your shoulder to the wheel, push along. And accepting this musical invitation, the sisters joined in. Soon the whole company was singing, and blessedly couldn't hear the contemptible remarks the soldiers were making. Do your duty with a heart full of song. We all have work, let no one shirk. Put your shoulder to the wheel. The next verse was perfectly written for the soldiers. Then don't stand idly looking on. The fight with sin is real. It will be long but must go on. Put your shoulder to the wheel. Song after song was sung during the next 2 hours of intense hard work by the company. When they finally got all the wagons to the top, the saints were relieved to see that they had a straight course to the fort in the distance. Show's over, men, said one of the browbeaters. That was better than any roundup I've ever witnessed. The men chuckled as they mounted their horses. The lieutenant yelled to his soldiers, Let's move 'em out, men. Captain MacArthur fired back. Wait up, Lieutenant. Unlike your soldiers, who have rested for the last 2 hours, we and our cattle have been working non-stop. We'll now be resting for an hour while we and our cattle get some nourishment. The oxen had been valiant in pulling the heavy laden wagons, especially in their tender-footed condition. Some had slathered sweat on their bodies, white saliva dripping from their mouths. They were lowing with heat fatigue. They needed to rest and have water. And before Lieutenant Walker could say anything more, the teamsters unhitched their oxen and started to take them to forage along the side of the road. The disgruntled soldiers dismounted again and resumed chewing and spitting tobacco, eating jerky, griping, and napping as they waited for the saints to start up again. Caroline watched Hurricane lead Buck and Doc to a few tufts of edible grass. She hurried to join him and ran directly to her oxen. Buck, how are you doing, boy? She said, rubbing his neck and looking into his eyes. She also gave Doc a cursory glance. He seemed to be more animated than Buck as he chomped on the dry grass in front of him. Caroline continued talking to Buck. You'll be all right, boy. Just a few more miles until you can all rest and get some water. She picked a handful of grass and tried to feed it to him. Try this, boy. Maybe it will have some moisture in it. Buck nudged the grass with his nose, began to eat it from her hand. Then he moved his head to the ground to find more grass, and was soon eating alongside Doc. You've really become attached to these oxen, haven't you? Said Hurricane, a little astonished. Caroline got tears in her eyes. I didn't think it was possible, but when you are talking to them every few minutes, and they respond to your voice, you can't help but form a bond with them. That's what makes a good driver, when you and your ox team work together. You know, I think Buck is going to make it. Caroline was very happy with his reassurance. Oh, I hope so. The next few miles to the fort will be critical. At the end of the hour-long rest, Hurricane got Buck and Doc hitched back up, and the girls, although they were still very tired, began moving again. The oxen and pioneers all walked a little slower now, as they trekked on the level but rocky road toward the fort. Some of the soldiers took their place at the front of the train, and some rode at the back, with a double line of riders along each side. The saints drew their children closer to them as they walked along and tried to ignore the soldiers, but that didn't dissuade them from trying to strike up conversations with the young ladies. "Hey, pull your bonnets back, girlies," said a private. "We want to get a better look at your faces." The other soldiers added their mocking encouragement. The seven sisters ignored the soldiers near them and ducked their heads as they walked along. "We want to see which ones of you we want to invite to go with us to the Fort Theater tonight. We've got a little musical production there. We'll have some entertainment, some drinks, some fun." They laughed leeringly. At that point, Marcus came riding up and overheard what the soldiers were proposing. He wasn't going to let it slide. "Sirs, I'm in charge of the safety of these women, and none of them will be accompanying any of you, anytime, anywhere." The soldier looked challenged, but didn't have time for a reply because Lavinia took the opportunity to express herself. "Captain Fielding is correct. I don't know about anyone else in this wagon train, but the sisters in this wagon will be attending a prayer meeting this evening, and there we will be entertained by the true word of God, teaching us that wickedness never was happiness. And in your case, Private, a babbling fool will come to ruin." The private snickered uneasily and then spoke to his riding companions. "Bunch of prudes in this wagon, anyway. Homely, too." Lavinia stiffened a little at this insult, but tried to act nonchalant. Another soldier chimed in. "What can you expect from Mormons?" "To hell with them," said one, and they rode on in silence, much to the delight of the sisters. It took several more hours on the road, but the train finally arrived at the fort just before dark. It had indeed taken them the whole day to get there. The lieutenant directed Captain MacArthur to an area outside the fort walls where they were to camp for the night. When the wagon circle was complete, MacArthur was direct. "Lieutenant Walker, since we had to come 12 miles out of our way to this fort today, with cattle that are about to drop dead from the strain of walking on sore feet, and who had to climb that treacherous hill without the support of food or water, we need to take care of them, and we need to take care of them now." Lieutenant Walker seemed irritated at MacArthur's forceful demand, but remarkably gave in without an argument. "I've been instructed to tell you that you can water your cattle in the stream about a quarter mile to the east of the fort, where there are some corrals and also some feed for your cattle, but you'll have to pay for the feed." Captain MacArthur couldn't believe his ears. He grew livid. "You want me to pay you for the inconvenience you have caused me today? Really? You, Lieutenant, are the one who should be paying me. You and your men are incompetent, insensitive louts, worse than any savage Indians I've ever seen or heard about. You're a disgrace to the oath you took to protect and defend everyone in this country." "Nevertheless, Captain, that's the way it is out here in the wild, wild West," he said with relish. "You still need to pay for your cattle's feed." Only a handful of saints heard this exchange, but those who heard it were rooting for the captain to have the last word. Unfortunately, he couldn't find words to express his anger. He just turned and gave an order. "Captain Andrews, tell the teamsters and brethren to get the cattle taken care of as soon as possible. It looks like the women are already starting to make camp." Under the watchful eye of the soldiers, the saints rushed around and did their assigned tasks of getting tents, bedding, and food prepared for the night. Finally, a bugle from the watchtower inside the fort sounded a pattern of notes over and over, which signaled for the soldiers to come inside the fort. When the ornery soldiers trotted their horses through the large gates, the saints felt much relief until they saw 5 Indians on paint ponies come out of the fort and walk their horses slowly past the Dixie train, eyeing the menfolk and trying to peer into the circle between the wagons. Captain MacArthur raised his hand in friendly gestures and smiled. "Yahate." The men nearby held up their hands in a similar way and repeated the greeting. The Indians' faces were unexpressive. They just grunted, kicked their horses, and galloped away. "Did you see those Indians just now?" said Fanny. "They came out of the fort, and here we are outside of the fort. They were not friendly Indians. I could tell by their faces." "We are in danger out here," said Phoebe. "Why aren't we inside the fort?" Lavinia knelt down in front of the twins and held onto their arms. Listen to me, twinsies. If we were inside the fort, it stands to reason If they were inside the fort, it stands to reason they are peaceable enough to come and go whenever they want. So they probably aren't a danger to anyone around here for the time being. Caroline was amazed at Lavinia's sudden change of attitude toward Indians. She watched in awe as Lavinia continued. We have our camp guards, and they will protect us. But they might just decide to come back after we are all asleep tonight, said Fanny, and steal us away one by one, just like you were stolen. Twinsies, I know you are afraid because of what happened to me, but I learned a very important lesson from my experience with those Indians, and that was to trust the Lord. When I finally calmed down enough to pray for help, he answered my prayers in the form of Hurricane and Caroline finding me, and the guard in my tent turning out to be sympathetic to my plight. That dear sister let us go without any regard to her own safety. She was truly a selfless woman, added Caroline. If you want, Eleanor added, I can talk to Captain Pinkerton and see if there can be a guard placed directly by our tent tonight. That would make me feel a whole lot safer, said Fanny. And another thing to think about, said Aunt Lucy. If we were attacked by Indians, I'm sure the soldiers would come out of the fort and save us. You'd think they would, said Susanna, but they haven't shown any compassion to us so far in our relationship. We'll be just fine, sisters, said Lavinia. Listen to yourself, Lavinia, said Caroline. You're turning into the voice of calm and reason. I'm so proud of you. She hugged Lavinia and then stepped back. But just in case anything happens, sisters, I think I'll sleep with Hurricane's gun under my pillow. That's the end of chapter 39. Over and out.